Hey, welcome to Mooney Reads. My name is Beck, and today I'm going to be walking you through my nonfiction favorites shelf. Over the past few days, I've had an itch to totally reorganize my bookshelves, which is completely ridiculous because so many other things in my house should be organized before I go through and really reorganize a lot of my books. So I compromised and decided to just reorganize this part of my shelf. I thought this was a good idea anyways because recently the books that have been on the shelf behind me have all been on my TBR. It's been my LGBT history TBR and my HIV and AIDS TBR. So it kind of makes more sense to have my favorites presented anyways. The reason that this favorites shelf only has nonfiction is because all of my nonfiction books are on these two bookshelves. My fiction books are on the other side of the room. I never take videos in front of my fiction shelves because the lighting is awful. I don't really want to mix them. It pained me a little bit to mix the topics that I had already separated out. So we're not adding fiction to that. Plus it would be more than a shelf and it would just be unruly. So I'm going to walk you through this shelf. Now I have it organized mostly alphabetical by author, the only exception being these first three books, because they are kind of bigger, so it would be awkward to have them sort of in the middle. And then the other one is a textbook, so I just left it back here. I don't really have a big reason. But the two bigger books are sort of coffee table books. There's the Quilt, which is the first edition of this book where they basically go through and talk about the people who are in the AIDS quilt. And we have this other kind of coffee table book of LGBT history that just has a lot of really beautiful photography as well as articles about things through gay history. The textbook that I have up here, I might move. I did really enjoy it, and I thought that it was super valuable, which is why it kind of ended up on this shelf in the first place. There are a couple of other textbooks that I've had that I've really liked, but this is one that I picked up on my own, and it has some different things about like teaching LGBT studies and how young people have done activism. It was really interesting. I think I've actually read most of it. I don't think that I sat and read it from cover to cover, but just going through and like seeing what articles look interesting. There are a few things that were relevant either to projects that I was doing in grad school and other stuff like that. So that's Sexualities and Education, a reader. From there, we actually get into things that are organized in a way that makes sense. We have The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander, which looks at the history of mass incarceration in the United States. It is absolutely a must-read. It's been on a fair amount of like the anti-racism lists and stuff that are out there. This is just really excellent, and I would highly recommend the 10th anniversary edition. I haven't gotten a chance to reread it like I wanted to, but I went ahead and I read the new introduction, and it is incredible. It definitely situates everything that's going on and shows how this is absolutely still relevant and necessary. Next, we have Fun Home by Alison Bechdel, which is a graphic memoir of her experience with her relationship with her dad, who she did not know was queer until he had passed. And we have Sorted by Jackson Bird, which I feel like I've talked about a fair amount. This is Jackson Bird's memoir, but it's also an excellent educational resource. Then we have Racism Without Racist by Eduardo Bonilla-Silva. This one I actually haven't seen on a lot of anti-racism lists, but it's really popular among sociologists. But I think that most people could probably read it and get a lot out of it. This is one that I read for a class in grad school, and a lot of it focuses on a study that he did where he interviewed a bunch of different people on race, and he kind of compares the differences of a lot of white people's approaches with black people's approaches, and really goes into how racism is and how it's changed. He really focuses on the kind of colorblind racism that has, before Trump's election anyways, was very popular. Of course, in the newer editions, he also situates this and talks a little bit about how this has changed, because while this is absolutely necessary, especially because there are still tons of people who have like that sort of mentality, I really like that he's still able to bring in more recent things as other editions come out. Next, we have Gender Outlaw by Kate Bornstein. This is part memoir, part gender studies. The original edition of Gender Outlaw was pivotal to gender studies, especially as it applied to looking at trans issues and things like that. But this is the updated version, and it is really excellent. Next is Black Feminist Thought, Knowledge, Consciousness, and the Politics of Empowerment by Patricia Hill Collins. This, I feel like I'm going to say this about all of the books that I have on here that I had in grad school, but this was one of the most important ones that I read in grad school, I think. But I think this is a really essential text that everyone who's interested in any sort of social justice movements could really benefit from. It really questions where we're getting our knowledge from. Even historically, all of the documents and all of the works that we use are largely from white men. So instead of centering those voices, she is centering Black women's voices throughout history, and she talks about the importance of this, and she talks about what you can find out when you do center those voices. I definitely did just take a book off of this shelf, but it's not because the book was bad, it's just because it wasn't supposed to be on my favorite shelf. The next book that is on the shelf is A Year Without a Name by Cyrus Dunham. This is another one that I have talked about a lot of different times. This is a memoir. It's a pretty literary memoir. It's reads a little bit more like a story, I guess, than most other memoirs, and there's a lot of interesting stuff that they do with the narrative. I connected with a lot of what they had to say, and I really enjoyed the way that they wrote the book. Next, I have Promises I Can Keep, Why Poor Women Put Motherhood Before Marriage by Kathryn, Edin, and Maria Kefalas. This was another book that I read for a grad school class, but it says a whole lot of important stuff on class, specifically in the intersection of being poor and being a mother. I thought that this was really insightful. This definitely debunked a number of misconceptions that people have. I know in the South, but also I think just like conservatives in general, this even talks about policies that were built around some of that mythology. I haven't necessarily used this book in a class that I teach, but Kathryn Edin's work in general, like excerpts of her stuff, are also in some of the textbooks and everything that have been used. So this is just really important. I could probably stand to reread it just to like remember what all was in it, but I remember really enjoying this, so it made its way onto this shelf. And we have Moving Politics, which I just read and did a really long video about. This looks at ACT UP during the AIDS epidemic, and it looks at the role that emotion plays in social movements, and that's just so cool. So it stays up here. Next, we have Laura Jane Grace's memoir. I do have the title partly covered up because it is a slur, but Laura Jane Grace's memoir was a really great read. I think I read it around May or so this year. For those who don't know, Laura Jane Grace is the lead singer of Against Me. This book covers her experience on the punk scene, so it's her talking about how she got into the music, the sorts of people that she was around, and her experience with that. She also talks about her experiences with drug abuse and her experience as a trans woman, and how a lot of that ended up intersecting in different ways. I really enjoyed this. It gave me a new appreciation for her music, and I think that it brings up kind of a lot of stuff that gets overlooked in the more like traditional trans narratives that get centered a lot of the time. Next we have Trans, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variability by Jack Halberstam. This basically goes in and talks about being trans. It goes through trans history, talking about trans identity. It also talks about trans representation, trans people, and feminism. There's just a lot of really good stuff in here. this book is definitely one of my go-tos for suggestions for folks who are learning about trans issues. Next, we have more educational content with The ABCs of LGBT by Ash Hardell. This is under his dead name, unfortunately, but this is a really great book. They actually made this collaboratively with kind of the LGBT community online at the time, and it's basically a large chunk of it is basically a dictionary. That being said, there's also a lot of discussion about how these words aren't supposed to just be like labels for people. There's a lot of really good conversation about why these words are useful. I think the chapter on spectrums is probably my favorite. And alongside all of this, there are also excerpts from people who identify as each of these different terms. So you get multiple people's experiences. So it's not just Ash's perspective on all of this. He brought in a lot of different people. So it's good stuff. Next, I have Colonize This by Daisy Hernandez and Bushra Raymond. This is a anthology on feminism, and it's just really excellent. I use it a whole lot. There are just so many issues that it really goes into that a lot of people end up overlooking. There are essays on kind of what feminism is to these different women. There are also essays on specific issues that we don't get to hear a whole lot about. Particularly, I think the discussion of reproductive rights in this is really good because it has kind of all angles. It doesn't just look at abortion access necessarily, although that is a part of it, and I think that there's a unique perspective on that in here, but it also looks at the right to have children. I think one of the things that impressed me most was the fact that they included trans women in that part of that discussion. So this is just a really great book. I would definitely recommend it if you're looking to expand your understanding of feminism. Then we have All Boys Aren't Blue by George M. Johnson, which is a memoir that goes through their experiences during childhood and through college, looking at their relationship with their sexuality and their gender and different parts of it. This memoir is technically marketed at YA, so if you're looking something kind of for that category, this would be really perfect. Another memoir is My Lesbian Experience with Loneliness. This one is a manga style memoir. A lot of this experience is clearly about her relationship with sexuality, but more than that, she talks a whole lot about mental health and societal expectations in a really great way. Then we have Amazon's Abolitionists and Activists by Mickey Kendall and Ada Amako. And this is a graphic history, so it looks like a comic book, and it goes through women's history starting way earlier than I think I've ever, personally read myself. There's just so much information in here, and clearly it's not going to cover every single little thing, but especially for the space that it has, the scope is incredible. They also don't skirt around certain issues. They'll talk about racism and ableism. There's even a section specifically on LGBT rights, disability rights. This is just a really great book. I would recommend it for all ages, honestly. I know that a lot of people see graphic novels, especially when it's something more simplistic like this for history. But honestly, as an adult, I got a decent amount out of it. Like I said, it's not going to go really deep into a ton of these issues, but it still has a lot of important stuff. Next is what might be my favorite nonfiction book that I've read this year. That is When They Call You a Terrorist, a Black Lives Matter memoir by Patrice Concolers and Asha Bandele. This is the memoir of one of the founders of the Black Lives Matter movement. She talks about her experience growing up in California in the 80s and not really the 90s. I think she was born towards the end of the 80s. I could be wrong. But she talks heavily about things like stop and frisk laws and other things that were really increasing the rates of incarceration. She talks about how that impacted a lot of the men in her life and how it impacted her. And then she talks about her experience with activism. This is beautifully written and incredibly important on top of that, but I would definitely recommend this. Next is Genderqueer by Maya Kobabe, another graphic memoir. I like those if you can't tell. But this is Maya's experience being genderqueer and asexual. So we get a lot of representation that we really don't get a whole lot of places. I really liked a lot of the illustrations, so this one was really great. Next is You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery by Dara Hoffman Fox. This is more of like a self-help workbook. So it's pretty different than some of the other books that are on this shelf, but I really got a lot out of this book. And I would highly recommend it really for any person who's trans, non-binary, or questioning. And even, I think, cis people would get a lot out of this too. It really leads you through the process of looking back on your life and kind of conceptualizing yourself. It also helps you build certain skills that will help with that. Things like how to unpack guilt and ways that you can comfort yourself. General skills that I think everyone should have. This is really excellent. Dara actually has a YouTube channel, and I think they were going through and reading sections of this, so definitely go check that out. Then we have Trans Like Me by C.N. Lester. This is part memoir and part cultural discussion. It talks a lot about the way that trans people are seen and have been talked about throughout history, and throughout different forms of media. This is super helpful, and this is another one that I have used excerpts from in my classes. Then we have White by Law by Ian Henny Lopez, and this looks at the legal construction of race. So this goes through the history of United States law, not just policies that they had, but also Supreme Court rulings, and how the law has historically been very racialized. There is a period of time where we were one of the few countries that had a racialized citizenship law, and one of the few other countries that had that at the same time was Germany. So the United States definitely has a long history of bullshit to contend with, and this breaks a lot of that down, and it looks at the justification that a lot of people used, which was not legal justification, even though it was Supreme Court rulings and things like that. So this was really eye-opening, and definitely one that I would recommend if you wanted to get more in-depth in the discussion of racial inequality in the U.S. Next, I have In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir, but it is told mostly in second person. So this has a really unique writing style. A lot of the chapters are pretty short, and this basically goes in and talks about her experience being in an abusive relationship with another woman. Not only is this perspective just really valuable, but it is an incredibly well-written book. This also has some chapters that frame all of this, that talks about the different societal elements that exacerbates the problem of abuse when queer women are facing it. So it talks about the media, and it also talks about just previous court cases of women who are in FF relationships trying to get justice for their situation and the problems that they've incurred. Next, we have Making History by Eric Marcus, which I've talked about so many different times. This is one of my go-to nonfiction recommendations, especially for people who aren't used to reading nonfiction, because these are oral histories. They are a series of interviews. So even though this book is pretty chunky, you can go through and just read one or two interviews at a time, and they're really easy to read. There's not really any jargon necessarily. But I also think that hearing history straight from the people who lived it, especially when we're looking at marginalized history, is so incredibly valuable. So it's on my favorite shelf. Next, we have another book from grad school, and that is American Apartheid by Douglas Massey and Nancy Denton. This is one of the books that really put a lot of pieces in place for me. Of course, at the time that I read this, I knew that racism was a problem. This wasn't like new information to me. I was the majority of the way through a sociology degree, but this had a lot of the specific details that I hadn't heard anyone outline when it came to segregation. Specifically, this looks at the issue of segregation within cities, and it talks about the difference in, part of what it talks about is the experience that certain ethnic groups had versus Black people, and why segregation impacted Black communities so much more. There is a bit of this that's a little bit number heavy, but I think that it's pretty readable, and there's a lot of really important information in here. Next is The Complete Persepholist by Marjane Satrapi. Back to the graphic memoir. This outlines her experience growing up in Iran, when it was in the middle of a lot of war and regime changes. The first part is really focused on her childhood, and then the second part is more on her adolescence, so her like teenage years and early adulthood. This was really incredible. I hadn't really read a whole lot on this area of the world, so there was some stuff that, taught me like pieces of history that I didn't know about. But also as a graphic memoir, this was just really good. I liked the art, and I also liked kind of the way that it was narrated, so you were able to get in those facts like that. But what sets this apart from some of the other ones that I've read is that you get a really good sense of a lot of these other characters. Like, even though her grandma and her dad aren't the focus of the story necessarily, you still get a good sense of who they are. Next, we have Just One of the Guys, Transgender Men and the Persistence of Gender Inequality by Kristen Schultz. This is another one that I read in grad school. It's talking about the workplace, and it's specifically looking at trans men's experience in the workplace. So how, or at least what a lot of men end up finding, is that they're treated better in a lot of instances. Of course, what I just described is mostly the experience of white trans men who pass or look cis, and it does mention a lot of that stuff in here. It also has a section towards the beginning that talks about people's access to hormones that I thought was really important. And it also, while it's not the main focus of it, it does talk about the fact that trans women have a totally different experience. So they don't get, the privileges that a lot of trans men see when they transition in the workplace. Now, the next book I have not read in a really long time, and I should probably reread it, but it is one of the books that really got me into nonfiction, and that is Tweak by Nick Sheff. This is Nick Sheff's experience being addicted to heroin and methamphetamines, and I must have reread this book at least 3 times, possibly more. I found this towards the beginning of when I was in college. I think a freshman in college, so 2011 or 2012. And I mean, I've even got post-it notes in here. I don't even write A's the same way that I did when I got this book, so you can tell how long it's been. But I just remember really liking this book, really liking his perspective and, the way that it's written, because there's a lot of it that's kind of written like a novel, and some parts of this are legitimately scary. And one of the things that I liked about this is that his dad also wrote a book, Beautiful Boy, which I liked, but I did not reread and enjoy to the same level as this. But being able to put their perspectives together kind of shows you the whole story of what addiction can do to somebody. So, since this was one of the books that actually got me into nonfiction, it's on this shelf. I need to reread it to actually vouch for it, but I do remember thinking that a lot of the writing was really good. He has a follow-up memoir as well that I have on ebook. We All Fall Down, I think is what it's called, which I enjoyed. I liked it, but I thought this was better written. The other one did seem more stream of consciousness, which is interesting. But I think that it maybe could have, like, gone through another edit, probably. We are close to the end. I don't know how long this video is going to be after I edit it. We're already at past 45 minutes of filming. That's great. But next we have Susan Sontag's Illnesses, Metaphor, and AIDS in Its Metaphors, which I talk about in the same video that I talk about moving politics. I thought that this had some incredibly insightful things to say about ableism. There's a lot of history that she goes over that I did not know about. I just got a whole lot from this, so it ended up on the shelf. Next we have Just Mercy by Bryan Stevenson. This is, I think that I read this in February, but this is Bryan Stevenson's memoir that looks at his experience as a pro bono lawyer that worked with people who were on death row. So this does a pretty hefty look into the legacy of racism with death row. The last part of it also talks about women who were in for life or on death row, as well as children who have been put in prison for life. So there's just so much really important stuff from this. And this is, like, I know I mentioned The New Jim Crow, which is excellent, and I do think that everyone should read. However, if you are less used to nonfiction, this would be a good gateway into kind of getting a little bit more used to it, because memoirs tend to read more like novels. And there is just so much in here that's really important, especially for, like, understanding race issues and things like that. I think it's also a movie. I have not seen the movie, so I don't know if it's good or not. But that also exists too, so if you're looking for a book that you can pair with a movie, there you have that. Next we have Beyond the Gender Binary by Alok Vaid Menon, which I spent a lot of time talking about in a video where I also talked about Leslie Feinberg's Transliberation, which should also be on this shelf. But I don't know where it is. That's a problem, because I could just have a stack of stuff somewhere. Which is just how my life is. So whenever I find it, I'll talk a little bit about that too, on the off chance that I also find other books with it, because usually when books aren't on a shelf, they are in a pile somewhere because I was making a list or an Instagram post. My life is a mess. Anyways, Beyond the Gender Binary, the beginning talks about a bit of Alok's experience as a non-binary person, and the last part debunks a lot of transphobic myths. So this is excellent for some 101 stuff, but it also made me cry. Like, I think when I can really connect with someone's experience like that, that's just really meaningful to me. So this is absolutely on my favorite shelf, and is definitely going to stay on my favorite shelf. The final book that we have is Race Matters by Cornel West. This is a, like, foundational text for critical race theory, which is essential for most of the other race texts that I've talked about. In this book, he goes through and talks about different perspectives on race, and talks about how they aren't cutting it, and talks about kind of the need for this new perspective. It was excellent. I thought that a lot of the analysis was super valuable. It would be really interesting to see this updated, because this was written in 1993. And there are other prefaces that do kind of situate this, but I would like to see it expanded a bit more. If you are really interested in anti-racism texts and getting into critical race theory, Cornel West is who you need. Now, I want to know where the fuck my Leslie Feinberg went. Ooh, here we go. This was underneath a blanket beside me. Don't ask me why. This is going on my favorite shelf, though, because I freaking love this book. I talk about it in the same video where I talk about a Lokes book, and this is a series of mostly speeches and some essays that Leslie Feinberg did when Z was around. There are also bits and pieces that other trans people wrote as well. There's actually a piece by Sylvia Rivera in here. And the things that Z has to say about liberation, about solidarity, are just incredibly valuable. I will say that, like, this was, I think this was published in '98, so a lot of this stuff Z probably put together in, like, the '90s and possibly the '80s, so the language is a little bit outdated, so you may, if you're not super used to reading stuff about trans people, you may need to pick up a primer, like one of the several that I've mentioned. But what Z actually has to say transcends whatever language differences there are. It's just so incredibly important, and yeah, I've got a lot of feelings on it, and if you want to look at more, you can watch that video, because otherwise I will ramble. So, that is my favorite shelf. Those are the books that you will see behind me. There are a couple of other shelves that are kind of visible. That is my Race in the U.S. TBR that you can see part of, and that is my HIV and AIDS TBR, and then my LGBT history TBR. You can't really see those most of the time, but that's a lot of feminist studies or gender-related stuff. Some I've read, some I haven't. But you probably can't make out those titles anyways, because my arm's in the way. Anyways, this shelf will evolve over time. I will add more to it. Thankfully, we've got some room. If I need to shuffle a couple of things around, I can technically do that. So I may make updates for this in the future at some point. But if you have read any of these, let me know what you thought about them, or if you have recommendations based on what my favorite nonfiction books are, I will happily take them. Thank you all so much for watching. Bye.